My dad called me a burden, then toasted my brother. I stayed silent until CNN cut in with breaking news. Lucia Stone, 33, promoted to brigadier general. His bourbon glass shook. My brother went pale, and my mom looked like the floor had just dropped out from under her chair. But before the news anchor said my name, before the red banner flashed across the screen, and before the silence in the room turned from oppressive to terrified, there was just the heat. It was a suffocating, wet heat that only July in Missouri could produce. It pressed against the double-paned windows of my parents' house like a physical weight, daring the air conditioning to fail. Inside, the air was cool but stale, recycling the smell of roasted chicken and old floor wax. We were gathered around the mahogany dining table, a piece of furniture my father loved more than he loved most people, because it was solid, expensive, and commanded the center of the room. My mother, Martha, had arranged the table with the kind of desperate symmetry that she believed could ward off conflict. Forks were aligned perfectly parallel. Napkins were folded into stiff, sharp triangles. The water glasses were filled to the exact same level. It was a beautiful tableau that masked the rot underneath, which was essentially the mission statement of the Stone family. I sat at the far end of the table. The spot nearest the kitchen door. It was the seat usually reserved for someone who needed to get up frequently to refill drinks or clear plates, which was why it was mine. My name is Lucia Stone, but in this house, I was just the extra spacing between the important guests. I am 33 years old. I work in national security. My job involves making decisions that shift geopolitical borders and managing assets that cost more than the entire zip code we were currently sitting in. But if you asked my father what I did, he would wave a dismissive hand and say I worked in logistics. To him, I was a paper pusher, a clerk, a spinster who lived in a small apartment and probably needed a loan. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration for my brother Leo. Leo sat to my father's right, the seat of honor. He was 31, handsome in a way that required maintenance, and wore a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to look effortless. I knew for a fact that the shirt cost $200 because I had paid off the credit card bill he used to buy it. Leo was telling a story about his job at a boutique public relations firm in the city. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing with a fork, capturing the room. And then, Leo said, grinning, the client was freaking out. Absolutely losing his mind over a typo in the press release. But I walked into the room, looked him in the eye, and told him that we control the narrative. If we do not make it a big deal, nobody else will. My father, Arthur, watched Leo with a look of undisguised adoration. He nodded, absorbing the wisdom of a man whose biggest crisis that week had been a misspelled hashtag. That is leadership, my father said, his voice deep and gravelly. That is the kind of instinct you cannot teach. You have it, Leo. You have the presence. I looked down at my plate. The chicken was dry. It always was. My mother was so afraid of undercooking things that she obliterated any moisture as a safety precaution. I cut a piece of meat, moving it around my plate to look like I was eating. Under the table, my hand rested on my phone. It was a secure device, heavy and encrypted. It vibrated once. A single, short buzz. I did not need to look at it to know what it meant. The operation I had been overseeing for 18 months was concluding. The chess pieces were moving. While Leo talked about controlling the narrative of a press release, I was waiting for confirmation that a hostile regime had just lost its eyes and ears in the Pacific. I kept my face blank. I had perfected this mask over 3 decades. It was the face of a dutiful daughter who had nothing interesting to say. My father cleared his throat. The sound was like a gavel striking wood. The conversation at the table died instantly. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to quiet down. Arthur Stone was about to speak, and in this house, that required an audience. He stood up slowly. He held his glass of bourbon by the rim, swirling the amber liquid. He looked around the table, making eye contact with everyone except me. He smiled at my mother, a tight, proprietary smile. Then he turned his full beam onto Leo. "I just want to say a few words," my father began. His voice was steady, practiced. He loved toasts. He loved the sound of his own voice framing the world. "Family matters," he said. "Legacy matters. When I look at this table, I see the future of the Stone name." He raised his glass higher, gesturing toward Leo. "To my son," he said. "The one who carries our name with confidence. The one who represents us well. The one who makes us proud." A ripple of applause went around the table. My Aunt Marlene clapped a little too loudly. Leo dipped his head, performing modesty. He knew his role perfectly. He was the golden calf, and we were the worshippers. Then, the air in the room shifted. My father turned. For the first time all night, his eyes landed on me. It was not a look of anger. Anger implies passion. This was colder. It was the look a man gives a piece of furniture that is slightly out of style but too heavy to move. It was dismissive. It was bored. "And my daughter," he said. He paused. He let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. I gripped the napkin in my lap so hard my knuckles turned white. "Well," he continued, clearing his throat. "Some people are meant to shine. Others are meant to carry weight." He took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn, then lowered the glass just an inch. "She is a burden," he said. "Always has been." He said it so casually, as if he were commenting on the weather or the price of gas. "She is a burden." A few people laughed. It was a nervous, jagged sound, the kind of laughter that tries to smooth over a social crack. Glasses clinked. Someone murmured something polite. I felt something crack in the center of my chest. It was a familiar fracture, an old injury being hit in the exact same spot. I could have spoken. I could have stood up and listed the 6 figures I had funneled into this house over the last decade. I could have mentioned the mortgage payments I made when his business faltered in 2008. I could have brought up the tuition, the car repairs, the medical bills I handled quietly, so he could keep pretending he was the provider. I did none of that. I sat there. I stared at the dry chicken on my plate. I let the insult settle over me like dust. This was the deal I had made with myself. I would endure the dignity to keep the peace. I would let them think I was nothing. And as long as I could protect them from the reality of their own mediocrity. My mother looked down at the table, folding the corner of her napkin over and over again. She heard it. She knew it was cruel. But silence was her survival strategy, and she was not going to break rank now. My father sat back down, satisfied. The toast was over. The hierarchy was established. Leo was the star. I was the gravity that held him down. Just get through dessert, I told myself. 10 more minutes. Eat the cake, drink the coffee. Then you can leave. You can get in your car, drive back to the base, and breathe. But the universe, it seemed, had a different schedule. Behind my father, mounted on the wall, was a 60-inch television. It had been on all evening, muted, cycling through baseball highlights and weather maps. It was just background noise. A flickering blue light that nobody was watching. As my father reached for the pitcher of water to refill his own glass, the screen flickered. It went black for a half-second. Then, it flooded the room with a bright, urgent red. My father frowned, irritated by the change in light. He half-turned in his chair, gesturing at me with his free hand. "Lucia," he said, snapping his fingers. "Fix that, will you? It is distracting." He did not say please. He did not look at me. He just issued a command to the help. I reached for the remote control that sat near my plate. My fingers brushed the plastic buttons. I meant to turn it off. I really did. I wanted to kill the light and fade back into the wallpaper. But as my thumb hovered over the power button, the text on the screen became clear. It was a banner, Scrolling rapidly from right to left. Breaking news. Department of Defense press briefing. I froze. My hand stopped. On the screen, the camera cut to a podium with a blue seal. It was a seal I saw every day. It was the seal of the Pentagon. My father turned back to the table, ignoring the screen, ready to launch into another story about Leo's childhood athletic prowess. "Why is that still on?" he asked, annoyed. I did not answer. I could not answer. Because on the screen the anchor was looking directly into the camera, and her lips were moving in a rhythm I recognized. It was the rhythm of a citation. I pushed the volume button. Up. The sound cut through the dining room, sharp and sudden. "Unprecedented leadership in the field of strategic intelligence," the anchor said. My father glared at me. "Turn it off, Lucia." I didn't move. "For actions that have significantly advanced national security interests." The camera cut away from the anchor. It replaced her face with a photograph. It was not a candid shot. It was an official portrait. The background was the American flag. The subject was wearing a dress uniform, dark blue, immaculate. On the shoulders, there were stars. The room went deadly silent. The face on the screen was mine. It was me. But not the version of me that sat at this table. The woman on the screen did not look down. She did not fold napkins. She stared straight ahead with eyes that could level a building. The anchor continued. Lucia Stone, 33, promoted to brigadier general. My father's hand was still on his bourbon glass. He stared at the television. He blinked, once, twice, as if his brain was rejecting the data his eyes were sending it. Leo stopped chewing. His fork hovered halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a physical fluid leaving his body. My mother let out a small, strangled sound. She looked from the TV to me, and then back to the TV. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the voice from the television, listing accolades that my family had never heard, because they had never asked. My father's bourbon glass rattled against the table. It was a small sound, glass against wood, but in the silence, it sounded like a gunshot. He was shaking. I slowly took my hand off the remote. I sat back in my chair. I looked at my father. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look past me. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated fear. The silence in the dining room was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and vibrating with the kind of tension that usually precedes an explosion. The only sound was the voice of the news anchor, calm and professional. Reciting a biography that sounded like fiction to everyone at the table except me. She spoke of 3 tours in conflict zones that my father could not find on a map. She mentioned the Distinguished Service Medal. She used words like classified and high-value asset. Each syllable was a hammer blow to the reality my father had carefully constructed over 30 years. A reality where he was the king, Leo was the prince, and I was the peasant sweeping the floors. I watched my father's hand. It was still gripping his glass of bourbon, but his knuckles were white, drained of blood. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal, betraying a tremor he could not suppress. He was not looking at me anymore. He was staring at the television screen, as if he could will it to go black, as if his disapproval alone was enough to sever the satellite feed. My brother, Leo, was the first to move. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. The arrogance that had been radiating off him 5 minutes ago, the smug assurance of the golden child, had evaporated. In its place was a naked, childish confusion. "This is a joke," Leo said. His voice was high, thin. He looked around the table, seeking an ally. "Is this some kind of prank? Did you hack the TV, Lucia?" He laughed. "Short, wet sound. That is it, isn't it? You hacked the feed. Very funny." I did not answer him. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes on my father. I wanted to see it, I needed to see the moment he realized that the daughter he called a burden had outranked his entire existence before she turned 30. The anchor continued. General Stone has been a pivotal figure in modern intelligence strategy, she said. Her promotion comes after 18 months of leading a joint task force on cyber, defense and counter-insurgency. My mother, Martha, slowly pushed her chair back. The wooden legs screeched against the hardwood floor, a harsh, tearing sound that made everyone flinch. She did not stand up. She just put distance between herself and the table, as if the plates and silverware were suddenly radioactive. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering a gasp or a sob. I could not tell which. My father finally set his glass down. He did it with extreme care, placing it exactly in the center of his coaster. He took a breath. I saw his chest expand, saw the familiar tightening of his jaw that meant he was preparing to reassert control. He was going to reject this. He was going to deny the evidence of his own eyes, because the alternative was admitting that he had been wrong. And Arthur Stone was never wrong. That cannot be right, my father said. He did not say it with confusion, he said it with authority. He said it like a correction. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. They have the wrong person, he said. Lucia, why is your picture on the television? What did you do? The question hung in the air, absurd and desperate. He was accusing me. Even now. With my face next to the Pentagon seal, his first instinct was to assume I had made a mistake, or committed a crime, or caused a problem he would have to fix. I pitied him then. It was a cold, sharp pity. He was a man drowning in shallow water, refusing to stand up. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but in that silent room, it carried like a bell. They do not have the wrong person, Dad. He shook his head, a violent, jerking motion. Don't lie to me, he snapped. You work in logistics. You track shipments. You told me that yourself. I told you I worked in supply chain management, I said. I never said what I was supplying. My Aunt Marlene, who had been frozen with a forkful of potato salad, halfway to her mouth, finally lowered her hand. She looked at me with a strange expression. It was not pride. It was fear. It was the realization that there was a stranger sitting among them. A stranger who looked like their niece, but carried the weight of a government on her shoulders. Leo scoffed. He picked up his wine glass, but his hand was shaking so badly he had to set it back down. This is ridiculous, Leo said. You? A general? You cannot even change a tire. Dad had to call AAA for you last Christmas. I turned to my brother. I didn't call AAA because I couldn't change the tire, Leo. I called them because I had a broken rib from a training exercise and I didn't want to explain why I couldn't lift the jack. Leo recoiled as if I had slapped him. My father slammed his hand onto the table. The silverware jumped. Enough! He roared. The shout echoed off the walls. It was the voice he used to end arguments, to shut down dissent, to restore the order he craved. Turn that off, he commanded, pointing a trembling finger at the television. Right now. But the television did not obey him. The anchor was finished, but the screen had shifted to a live feed. It showed a podium in Washington, D.C. A man in a suit walked up to the microphone. I recognized him immediately. It was the Secretary of Defense. My father stood up. He grabbed the remote control from where I had left it on the table. He mashed the power button with his thumb, pressing it down hard, trying to kill the image. The screen went black. The red glow vanished. The room was plunged back into the dim, yellow light of the chandelier. My father stood there, breathing heavy, holding the remote like a weapon. He looked around the table, daring anyone to speak. He had silenced the messenger. He thought that meant he had killed the message. He looked at me, his face flushed with exertion and anger. I don't know what kind of game you are playing, he hissed. But you do not bring this drama into my house. Not tonight. Tonight is about your brother. He picked up his glass again, but it was empty. He stared at it, confused. Sit down, Arthur, my mother whispered. He whipped his head around to look at her. What did you say? I said sit down, she said, her voice shaking but audible. He stared at her, stunned. Martha never gave orders. I looked at my father, standing there in his expensive suit, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner party that had died 10 minutes ago. I thought about the word he had used. Burden. I thought about the monthly transfer of $2,000 I sent to his business account. I labeled anonymously as consulting fees so his pride wouldn't bruise. I thought about the time Leo crashed his car, and I paid the settlement to keep it off the police record. I thought about every time I had swallowed my own voice to let them feel big. Something in me shifted. The crack in the porcelain was not just a fracture anymore. It was a break. The structure could not hold. I did not realize I was standing up until I felt the floor beneath my feet. I smoothed the front of my dress. It was a cheap dress, something I bought at a department store, so I wouldn't look too successful. I felt ridiculous in it now. It was a costume. I am not playing a game, Dad, I said. My father laughed, a harsh, bitter bark. Then explain it, he said. Explain why my daughter, the one who can barely pay her own rent, is suddenly headline news. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile I wore when I entered a negotiation I knew I had already won. I can pay my rent, Dad. I said softly. I can pay yours too. In fact, I have been paying it for 3 years. The silence that followed that statement was different. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of a lie being ripped out by the root. My father's face went from red to a ghostly, ash gray. What? He whispered. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, right next to the crystal glasses and the folded napkins. The business loan, I said. The refinance in 2019. The gap in Leo's salary when he got fired from the agency. Who do you think covered that? The bank. I looked at Leo. You think you got a lucky break? I asked him. You think the world just decided to be nice to you? Leo stared at me, his mouth open. I did that. I said I carried the weight. I looked back at my father. I asked. So you can call me a burden if it makes you feel like a patriarch, I said. You can toast your son and pretend he is the success story. But do not ever think for 1 second that you are the one holding this table up. I paused, letting the words land. Because I am the only reason you still have a table to sit at. My words hung in the air like smoke, choking the oxygen out of the room. I am the only reason you still have a table to sit at. For a long moment, nobody moved. My father looked at the mahogany surface beneath his hands, as if he expected it to dissolve into sawdust. His reality. The one where he was the benevolent provider, and I was the charity case, was fracturing. But human beings are resilient creatures, especially when their egos are at stake. They will stitch a lie back together with nothing but denial and duct tape if they have to. Arthur Stone blinked. He pulled his hands back from the table, straightening his cuffs. He looked at me, not with gratitude, and not with shame. He looked at me with the calculation of a man looking for a loophole in a contract. You are confused, he said. His voice was steady again, regaining that practiced baritone of authority. You helped out a few times. We appreciate it. But let us not rewrite history, Lucia. I have provided for this family for 40 years. A few checks from you during a lean month does not change that. He picked up his napkin and dabbed at the corner of his mouth, signaling that the subject was closed. It was breathtaking. The speed with which he rewrote the narrative was honestly impressive. In my line of work, we call it retrofitting intelligence. You take the facts you do not like, and you bury them under a pile of comfortable assumptions until they disappear. Leo let out a breath, a sharp exhalation of relief. He seized onto my father's denial like a drowning man grabbing a life raft. Exactly, Leo said. He laughed, a nervous, brittle sound. God, Lucia. You had me going for a second. You always were dramatic. Remember when you were 10, And you told everyone you were running away, because Mom forgot to buy your favorite cereal. He looked around the table, inviting the guests to join him in this new, safer version of reality. A version where I was just hysterical, not powerful. You helped out, Leo continued, waving his hand dismissively. Sure. We all help out. I bought the wine tonight. Does that mean I own the house? He took a sip of his wine, his eyes darting toward me, challenging me to escalate. I sat slowly back into my chair. The adrenaline that had surged when I stood up began to cool into a hard, crystalline clarity. I looked at my brother. He was wearing a shirt I paid for, drinking wine that cost less than the tax on his car, which I also paid for, and lecturing me on the nature of contribution. I realized then that it did not matter what I said. I could show them the bank statements. I could print out the wire transfers. I could have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs walk through the front door and salute me. It would not matter. To them, I was a fixed point in the universe. I was Lucia the quiet. Lucia the dull. Lucia the burden. If I moved from that spot, their entire world would tilt, and they would do anything to keep the horizon level. I looked past Leo, toward the ceiling. Above us, in the attic, there were 3 cardboard boxes. They were shoved into the corner, behind the Christmas decorations and the old golf clubs my father swore he would use again. Those boxes contained my life. When I received the Bronze Star, I sent it home. I thought maybe my father would put it on the mantel, next to Leo's debate club trophy. Instead, my mother called me a week later. She said, barely above a whisper, that they had put it away for safekeeping. They did not want to make Leo feel bad. He was between jobs then, struggling to find his footing, and a medal for valor might have upset the delicate ecosystem of his self-esteem. So, into the box it went. When I was promoted to colonel, I sent a framed photograph. It went into the box. When I led a team that extracted 4 hostages from a compound in the desert, receiving a citation from the president, I sent a copy of the letter into the box. They were buried under layers of dust and insulation, sealed with packing tape, labeled in my mother's handwriting Lucia's things. Not Lucia's achievements. Not Lucia's honors. Just things. Like old sweaters or paperback books that no one wanted to read. I looked back at Leo. He was gaining confidence now, buoyed by my silence. Look, he said, leaning forward. It is great that you got a promotion. Really, Brigadier General sounds very fancy. But let us be real, Lucia. It is administrative, right? It is logistics. You are organizing supply lines. You are basically a glorious office manager. He smirked, glancing at my father for approval. It is government work, Leo added. They probably hand out titles like that to anyone who stays for 10 years. It is grade inflation. My father nodded. It is a stable job, Arthur said, benevolently. We are glad you have security, Lucia. But do not try to make it a competition. Your brother is in the private sector. It is a different world. It is a meritocracy. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat. It was a dangerous thing, that laugh. If I let it out, it would sound like glass breaking. A meritocracy. I thought about the last 18 months. I thought about the situation room at 3 in the morning, the smell of stale coffee and fear. I thought about the weight of a decision that could save 1,000 lives or end them. I thought about the people and reported to me. Men and women who were sharper, faster, and braver than anyone at this table, and who looked at me with absolute trust. And here I was, being explained to by a man who once called me in a panic because he could not figure out how to assemble an IKEA bookshelf. I looked at my hands. They were steady. They were the hands of a woman who could strip a weapon in the dark, who could calm a terrified asset in a safe house, who could sign an order that launched a drone strike. Leo mistook my silence for submission. Hey, he said, his voice softening into a patronizing, soothing tone. Do not feel bad. We are proud of you. Someone has to keep the paperwork moving, right? He reached for the wine bottle to refill his glass. I watched the red liquid pour. "You are right, Leo," I said softly. He looked up, smiling. "I am." "Yes," I said. "It is all just paperwork." I picked up my fork. I pushed the dry chicken around my plate. "Just paperwork," I repeated. "Like the deed to this house." Leo froze. My father's head snapped up. "The deed is in my name," my father said, his voice tight. "Is it?" I asked, not looking up. "You sure?" "Because, when the bank threatened foreclosure in 2011, the terms of the refinancing were very specific. The title transfer was part of the collateral agreement." I finally looked up, meeting my father's eyes. "You signed it, Dad. You didn't read it?" "Because you were too busy drinking scotch and complaining about the economy, but you signed it." The color drained from his face again. "That is not possible," he whispered. I took a sip of my water. It was warm. "I own the mortgage, Dad. I own the debt. And legally, I own the roof you are sitting under." I turned to Leo, whose smile had vanished completely. "And Leo, that paperwork you hate so much, it is the only reason you have a bedroom to sleep in when your startup fails next month." Leo dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "How do you know about the startup?" he whispered. "I haven't told anyone." I smiled. It was the same smile the general wore on the television screen. "I work in intelligence, Leo. I know everything." The silence that followed my admission was absolute. But it was not empty. It was filled with the invisible, suffocating debris of a family mythology that had just been detonated. I watched Leo. He looked like a man who had walked into a glass door he had been assured was open. His mouth hung slightly ajar, and his eyes darted around the table, searching for a place to rest that was not my face. "You spied on us," my father whispered. He did not sound angry anymore. He sounded horrified. To Arthur Stone, privacy was the ultimate luxury. It was the place where he kept his failures. And I had just told him that I had a key to the vault. "I did not spy on you," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I vetted you. There is a difference." "Vetted us?" Leo choked out the words. "Like we are criminals. Like you are liabilities," I said. I picked up my water glass, watching the condensation slide down the crystal. "When you hold a security clearance at my level, Leo, the people around you become points of leverage. Foreign intelligence services look for weak links. They look for debt. They look for gambling habits. They look for failing startups and desperate need for validation." I took a sip of water. "You were a flashing neon sign, Leo. I had to make sure nobody else bought you before I could bail you out." My mother, Martha, made a small, whimpering sound. She reached out and touched my father's arm, her fingers trembling. "Arthur," she said softly. "Please." She was pleading with him to stop, to fix it, to make the ugliness go away so she could serve the dessert. But my father pulled his arm away. He was looking at me with a mixture of fear and revulsion. "You are cold," he said. He said it like it was a diagnosis. "You sit there, eating my food, drinking my wine, and you talk about your own brother like he is an asset to be managed. You are cold, Lucia. You always have been. That is why you are alone." The words were meant to hurt. They were meant to find the soft, lonely part of me that used to cry in her bedroom when she was 16. But they struck armor. I had forged that armor in places my father could not imagine, under pressures that would have turned him to dust. "I am not alone, Dad," I said. "I am commanded." And then, the intrusion began. It started with a single chime. It came from Leo's pocket. His phone, which he had silenced but not turned off, lit up against the dark fabric of his trousers. Then, another sound. A vibration against the hardwood table. Aunt Marlene's phone, sitting next to her plate, buzzed and walked an inch across the mahogany. Then a ping from the sideboard where my mother had left her purse. The room, which had been sealed tight against the world, was suddenly porous. The news cycle had caught up. The broadcast I had silenced on the television was rippling out through the digital network, finding every device in the room. Leo reached into his pocket slowly, like he was reaching for a grenade. He pulled out his phone. The screen was bright in the dim room. He stared at it. His thumb scrolled up, then froze. "What is it?" my father demanded. Leo did not answer him. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide, reflecting the blue light of the screen. "It is trending," Leo whispered. He turned the phone around so my father could see. "Top story on Twitter," Leo said. "Or X? Whatever." "It is everywhere." My father squinted at the screen. I knew what he was seeing. I knew the headline because I had approved the press release 12 hours ago. "Enigma in the Pentagon. The Brigadier General who came from nowhere." "Read it," I said. Leo swallowed hard. It says you are the architect of the Deep Pacific Defense Initiative." Leo read. His voice wavered. "It says you are being shortlisted for the National Security Council." He scrolled down. "There are comments," Leo said. "Thousands of them." "Read one," I said. Leo hesitated. He looked at his father, then at me. He looked down at the phone. "User Patriot 7 says, finally, a leader who does the work instead of chasing the camera. A silent guardian." The room went quiet again. The phrase "silent guardian" hung in the air, contrasting violently with the word "burden" my father had used 20 minutes ago. My father turned away from the phone. He looked at the blank television screen, then at the window where the night pressed against the glass. He looked trapped. The world outside, the world he thought he understood, was celebrating the daughter he had dismissed. Strangers were calling me a hero while he sat in the house I owned and called me cold. "It is a mistake," my father muttered. "It is the media. They build people up just to tear them down. You know that, Leo. You work in PR. It is all spin." He was desperate. He was clawing at the walls of his own irrelevance. "It is not spin, Arthur," I said. "It is results." My mother stood up abruptly. She smoothed her skirt with frantic, jerky movements. "Who wants pie?" she asked. Her voice was too loud, too bright. "I made apple. And there is vanilla ice cream." She looked around the table, her eyes wide and wet, begging us to participate in the charade. "Lucia," she asked, "you love apple pie." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years smoothing over the rough edges of my father's ego, filling the cracks with silence and sugar. She was a casualty of this war, but she was also a collaborator. "I do not want pie, Mom," I said. "Oh, but you must have something," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "We have coffee. I can make a fresh pot. It will only take a minute." She was moving toward the kitchen now, fleeing the tension, retreating to the one domain where she felt she had control. I watched her go. I watched the way her shoulders hunched, the way she kept her head down. I realized then that I could not save her. I could pay the mortgage, I could fix the roof. I could keep the wolves from the door. But I could not save her from the cage she had built for herself. I turned back to the men at the table. Leo was still staring at his phone. Reading the comments that dismantled his worldview 140 characters at a time. My father was staring at his empty bourbon glass, looking old and small. The intrusion was complete. The truth was in the room, sitting in the empty chair, eating the air. I checked my watch. It was 1900 hours. My driver would be 2 minutes out. I pushed my chair back. The sound was final. "I am leaving," I said. My father looked up. His eyes were dull, the fire gone. "You can't leave," he said weakly. "We haven't had dessert." I stood up. I picked up my purse. I looked at the table, at the dry chicken, the untouched wine. The perfect napkins. "I have had enough," I said. I walked toward the hallway. I did not hurry. I walked with the cadence of a woman who walks through corridors of power.
"Lucia,"
Leo called out. I stopped. I did not turn around. "What?" I asked. I heard him shuffle in his chair. "Is it true?" he asked. "About the house? Do you really own it?" I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. Check the county clerk's website, Leo, I said. It is public record. Just like my promotion. I walked to the front door. The air in the hallway was cooler, less stifling than the dining room. I reached for the handle. Lucia, wait. It was my father. He had followed me. He stood in the archway of the dining room, holding onto the doorframe as if he needed the support. I turned to face him fully. He looked stripped down. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. You are my daughter, he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, a last-ditch attempt to reassert the biological hierarchy. Yes, I said. I am. Then why? He asked. His voice cracked. Why did you let me think? Why did you let me go on like that? If you were successful, if you had money, why did you let me treat you like a burden? I supplied. He flinched. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had taught me that love was conditional, that value was external, and that silence was the only acceptable form of dissent. Because, Dad, I said quietly, I wanted to see if you could love me without the title. I watched the realization hit him. I watched the shame wash over his face, red and hot. And, he breathed. I opened the door. The night air rushed in, smelling of rain and wet asphalt. And now we both know the answer, I said. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch clicked. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had heard all evening. It was a mechanical period at the end of a sentence that had run on for 33 years. I stood on the concrete porch. The humid Missouri air wrapping around me like a wet blanket. The crickets were screaming in the tall grass, a chaotic, deafening rhythm that felt perfectly matched to the buzzing in my own blood. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the sudden withdrawal of the adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation. I gripped the wrought iron railing, the metal warm and rough under my palms, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of ozone and impending rain, that thick, electric scent that builds up right before a summer storm breaks the heat. I looked at my watch. 1902 hours. My extraction was close. I should have walked down the driveway. I should have stood by the mailbox and waited for the headlights to sweep around the corner. But my feet felt heavy, magnetized to the concrete. Part of me, the part that was still a little girl wanting to be chased, was waiting. Behind me, the front door opened. I did not turn around. I knew the footsteps. They were light, shuffling, hesitant. They were the footsteps of a woman walking on eggshells in her own home. Lucia. My mother's voice was a whisper, thin and tremulous. I kept my eyes on the dark line of trees across the street. Go back inside, Mom, I said. Your ice cream is melting. She stepped out onto the porch, the screen door slapping shut behind her. It was a flimsy barrier between us and the wreckage in the dining room. But it muted the silence of the house just enough. You cannot leave like this, she said. It is not right. I turned slowly. Martha Stone stood hugging herself. Her arms wrapped tight around her waist, as if she were trying to hold her internal organs in place. She looked smaller than she had 10 minutes ago. The perfect hostess facade had cracked, leaving behind a frightened, aging woman in a floral dress. It is not right, I repeated. I let out a short, dry laugh. That is an interesting choice of words, Mom. Was it right when he called me a burden? Was it right when you stared at your napkin, instead of defending me? She flinched, looking down at her shoes. He did not mean it, she said. It is just his way. He is old, Lucia. He is proud. He does not know how to express it. I stared at her. It was the same excuse she had been making for him since I was 5 years old. He is tired. He is stressed. He didn't mean to yell. He didn't mean to forget your birthday. It was a litany of forgiveness for sins he never even apologized for. He expressed it perfectly, I said. He used English words. He used a microphone tone. There was no ambiguity. Martha took a step toward me, her hand reaching out but stopping halfway, hovering in the damp air. He feels threatened, she pleaded. You have to understand, Leo needs help. You do not. You have always been strong. You can take it. I felt a surge of rage so pure it almost blinded me. This was the core of it. The tax on competence. Because I could survive the neglect, I was expected to endure it. Because I did not break, I was assumed to be unbreakable. I can take it, I asked, my voice rising. Is that my role? To be the shock absorber for this family? To absorb the insults so Leo can feel like a big man and Dad can feel like a king? I am not saying that, she whispered. You are saying exactly that, I snapped. You are saying that my strength justifies his cruelty. I stepped closer to her, invading the bubble of personal space she usually guarded so carefully. You knew, Mom. That is the part I cannot get past. You knew I was paying the bills. You saw the bank statements. You saw the wire transfers. You signed the checks for the grocery delivery that I paid for. She went pale, her eyes darting away. I didn't ask questions, she stammered. I just wanted peace. Peace, I scoffed. You didn't want peace. You wanted quiet. There is a difference. I pointed at the door at the house that loomed behind her. You let me subsidize a lie, I said. You let me pay for the stage so Dad could perform his play. And every time he insulted me, every time he ignored me, you let it happen because it was easier than telling him the truth. Because telling him the truth would have shattered him. She began to cry, silent tears tracking through the powder on her cheeks. I wanted to protect him, she sobbed. He is my husband. And I am your daughter, I said. The words hung between us, heavy and wet as the air. I am your daughter, I repeated, softer this time. But you chose him. You chose his ego over my dignity. Every single time. She looked at me then. Really looked at me, through the tears. And in her eyes, I saw the tragedy of it. She loved me. I knew she loved me. But she feared him. And in the Stone household, fear was the only currency that mattered. Lucia, please, she begged, reaching for my hand. Just come back inside. Apologize. Tell him you were upset. We can fix this. We can go back to how it was. I pulled my hand away as if she had burned me. Go back to how it was? I asked, incredulous. You want me to go back to being the burden? You want me to put the genie back in the bottle so you can finish your pie? I shook my head, backing away toward the stairs. I cannot do that, Mom. I grew out of that box a long time ago. Headlights swept across the lawn, cutting through the darkness. Two bright beams illuminated the oak tree, then swung toward the driveway. A black SUV, sleek and armored, pulled up to the curb. It was not a taxi. It was a government vehicle. With tinted windows and diplomatic plates. My ride is here, I said. Martha stared at the car. It looked like a spaceship that had landed in her suburban neighborhood. It was alien. It was threatening. It was mine. You are really leaving? She whispered. I looked at the house one last time. I looked at the window of the dining room. I could see the silhouette of my father, still sitting at the head of the table, a king in an empty castle. I am not leaving, Mom, I said. I am deploying. What? She asked, confused. I am going to a place where people tell the truth, I said, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. I turned and walked down the steps. The concrete was hard under my heels. Lucia, she called out, her voice cracking. I kept walking. The rear door of the SUV opened before I even reached it. A young captain in dress uniform stepped out, standing rigid, snapping a salute that was sharp enough to cut glass. General Stone, he said. I returned the salute, casual but precise. Captain, I said. My mother gasped. I heard it from the driveway. Seeing her daughter, the girl she used to scold for muddy shoes, I being saluted by a man in uniform was the final nail in the coffin of her denial. I climbed into the back seat. The interior was cool, smelling of leather and conditioned air. It was a sanctuary. As the captain closed the door, I looked out the window. My mother was standing on the porch, illuminated by the yellow porch light. She looked like a ghost. She raised a hand, a weak, wavering wave. I did not wave back. "Drive," I said to the man in the front seat. The engine purred, a deep, powerful sound. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the side mirror. It got smaller and smaller, until it was just a speck of light in the darkness. No bigger than a star, and just as distant. I sat back, closing my eyes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from the bank. The automatic transfer for the mortgage was scheduled for tomorrow. I pulled out the phone. I opened the banking app. I navigated to the recurring payments tab. I found the entry labeled Stone Estate. I hovered my thumb over the button marked Cancel. The car hit a bump, jostling my hand. I took a breath. This was it. The nuclear option. The button that would turn the lights out on their fantasy. I pressed it. Confirmed. The screen flashed. I locked the phone and dropped it into my purse. The car accelerated, merging onto the highway, heading toward the airfield, heading toward Washington, heading toward a life where I was not a burden, but a weapon. And for the first time in 33 years, I did not feel heavy. I felt weightless. The silence inside the armored SUV was a different kind of silence than the one I had left behind in the dining room. The silence in the house had been jagged, full of sharp edges and unspoken accusations. The silence in the car was pressurized. It was the hum of shielded electronics, the soft thrum of reinforced tires on asphalt. And the professional, indifferent quiet of men who were paid to keep me alive. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. The suburban landscape of Missouri rolled past, a blur of strip malls and gas stations illuminated by harsh sodium streetlights. It all looked so small. That was the tragedy of it. The kingdom my father ruled, the legacy he was so obsessed with protecting, was nothing more than a 3-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac in a town that most of the world could not find on a map. My personal phone, the one I kept separate from my secure comms, buzzed in my lap. It was a violent, angry vibration. I looked down. The screen lit up with a name. Leo. I did not pick it up. I watched the notification slide across the glass. "You cannot do this," the message read. "Mom is hyperventilating. Dad is throwing things. Turn the car around." Another buzz. "Lucia, seriously, stop the drama. Come back and fix this. Fix this." That was the mantra of my life. Fix the leak. Fix the debt. Fix the ego. Fix the reality so it does not hurt them. For 20 years, I had been the family mechanic, greasing the gears of their dysfunction with my own money, and my own self-respect. I swiped the message away. The captain in the front seat, the one who had saluted me, cleared his throat softly. "General," he said, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "We are 20 minutes out from Whiteman Air Force Base. The flight crew is prepped. We have a wheels, uptime of 20-100. I nodded. "Thank you, Captain." "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. He was young, but he had the sharp, assessing gaze of someone trained to spot instability. "Everything is fine," I said. "I just closed a very long, very expensive account." He nodded once and returned his eyes to the road. He did not ask what I meant. In our world, you did not ask questions, unless you had the clearance to hear the answers. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail notification. From my father. I stared at the little icon. I knew I should not listen to it. I knew that whatever was on that recording would be designed to maim. Arthur Stone did not fight with fists. He fought with disappointment. He weaponized his own expectations until you felt like you were suffocating under the weight of them. I picked up the phone. I put it to my ear. The recording started with a rustling sound, then a heavy, wet breath. "You are ungrateful," my father's voice said. It was slurred, thick with the bourbon he had been drinking all night. "I gave you everything. I gave you a name. I gave you a home. And you throw it in my face. You think a rank makes you better than us. You are nothing without this family. You hear me. You are nothing. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone. I expected to feel pain. I waited for the old ache, the familiar tearing sensation in my chest that happened whenever he told me I wasn't enough. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, clinical detachment. I felt like a doctor examining a patient with a terminal illness. I analyzed the data points. The slur in his voice. The illogical premise of his argument. The desperate, flailing attempt to reclaim control. He was not a giant. He was just a drunk old man, yelling at a daughter he had never bothered to know. I thought back to the first time I paid a bill for him. I was 22. Fresh out of officer candidate school. I had come home for Christmas to find the heat turned off. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, weeping. He had gambled on a business deal that went south. He was 4 months behind on the utilities. I didn't say a word. I drove to the utility company. I wrote a check for $800. It was half my savings at the time. When the heat kicked back on, the vents rattling with the sudden influx of warmth, my father dried his eyes. He didn't say thank you. He just said good. It is working again. He never asked how it happened. He never asked where the money came from. He just accepted the miracle, because he believed he deserved miracles. And I, in my naivety, thought that if I performed enough miracles, eventually he would see the saint standing behind them. But he never saw the saint. He only saw the service. My phone buzzed again. A text from my mother. Lucia, please. He is scaring me. Just tell him you didn't mean it. Just tell him the transfer is still active. I closed my eyes. This was the trap. The emotional hostage situation. My mother was the collateral damage he used to keep me in line. If I didn't pay, he would be miserable. If he was miserable, she would suffer. Therefore, to save her, I had to pay him. It was a perfect, closed loop of manipulation. But I was a general now. I understood strategy. And I knew that you do not negotiate with terrorists, even if they share your DNA. I typed a reply. My fingers were steady. I canceled the mortgage, Mom. I canceled the stipend. I canceled the credit card Leo uses. It is all gone. If he is scaring you, leave. You have a sister in Chicago. Go to her. I hit send. It was a brutal thing to do. I knew that. I was cutting the safety net, while they were still walking the tight wire. But they had spent 30 years believing the net was there by magic. It was time they learned about gravity. The car slowed down. We were approaching the gate of the Air Force Base. The guard, a young airman with an M4 rifle strapped across his chest, stepped out of the booth. He saw the diplomatic plates. He saw the flag on the hood. He snapped to attention and waved us through. As we passed the checkpoint, I felt a physical shift in the atmosphere. The chaotic, messy, emotional world of my family was behind the fence. Inside, everything was ordered. Everything had a purpose. The runway lights stretched out in perfect parallel lines, and orange and blue jewels against the black asphalt. We pulled up to the tarmac. A Gulfstream jet was waiting, its engines whining with a high-pitched scream. The stairs were down. A crew chief stood at the bottom, holding a clipboard. The SUV stopped. The captain jumped out and opened my door. General on deck, he announced to the empty air. I stepped out of the car. The wind on the airfield was strong, smelling of jet fuel and burnt rubber. It was the smell of my life. It was the smell of leaving. I reached into my purse and pulled out my personal phone. It was still vibrating. Leah, Mom. Dad. Leo again. A chorus of panic. I looked at the device. It was the only tether left. It was the only way they could reach me. As long as I held it, I was still Lucia the daughter. Lucia the sister. Lucia the burden. I looked at the captain. Do you have a secure disposal bag? I asked. He looked surprised, but he nodded. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a thick, lead-lined pouch used for transporting classified hard drives. I held the phone over the bag. General, he asked, you want to secure it? No, I said. I want to destroy it. I dropped the phone into the bag. It landed with a dull thud. "Incinerate it when you get back to headquarters," ordered. "Yes, ma'am." I turned away from the car. I walked toward the plane. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. I did not brush it away. I climbed the stairs. At the top, a flight attendant was waiting. She held a silver tray with a hot towel. "Welcome aboard, General," she said. "We are cleared for immediate departure to Andrews. The chairman is expecting you for the morning briefing." I took the towel. It was hot, steaming. I wiped my hands. I wiped the invisible grease of the dining table, the sticky residue of the humidity, and the lingering touch of my mother's pleading fingers off my skin. "Thank you," I said. I walked into the cabin. It was quiet. It was empty. There was a single leather seat waiting for me, with a secure briefing folder placed perfectly in the center of the desk. I sat down. I buckled the belt. I opened the folder. Top secret, the cover page read, Operation Blindside. I stared at the words. This was real. This was high stakes. This was a world where mistakes cost lives, not just feelings. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely, utterly safe. The plane began to taxi. I felt the rumble of the engines build in the floorboards. We turned onto the main runway. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. As we gathered speed, pushing you back into the seat, I looked out the window. The lights of the base flashed by, faster and faster. Then the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. We climbed into the darkness. The lights of the Missouri town, the town where I had been born, the town where I had been called a burden, shrank beneath me. They became a grid. Then a cluster. Then a smudge. And then we punched through the cloud layer, and there was nothing but the stars. I took a deep breath. I let it out. I was an orphan. I was a villain. I was a general. And I was free. The wheels of the Gulfstream touched down on the runway at Andrews Air Force Base with a sharp, chirping skid that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the faint blue wash of the LED path lighting on the floor. I had not slept. For the 2-hour flight, I had stared at the folder labeled Operation Blindside, reading the intelligence reports, the satellite intercepts, and the casualty projections. I had absorbed the data, organized it, and formulated a strategy. It was what I did. It was who I was. And for the first time in years, the silence in my head was not filled with the anxiety of a daughter wondering if she had done enough to be loved. It was filled with the cold, clear calculus of a general wondering if she had enough assets to prevent a war. The plane taxied to a halt, near the Distinguished Visitors Terminal. The engines whined down, a dying mechanical scream that faded into the ambient noise of the airfield. The flight attendant opened the cabin door. The air that rushed in was different from the air in Missouri. It was not heavy with corn pollen and humidity. It smelled of jet fuel, wet concrete, and the swampy, brackish scent of the Potomac River. It smelled like power. I unbuckled my seatbelt. The metallic click in the quiet cabin. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I picked up the classified folder. I did not have a bag. I had left my purse, my clothes, and my entire civilian identity in the back of an armored SUV in the Midwest. All I had was the uniform on my back and the clearance on my badge. I walked down the stairs. The tarmac was wet. It had rained here recently. A black sedan was waiting at the bottom of the steps, its engine idling. 2 men in dark suits stood by the rear door. They were diplomatic security service. They did not look tired, even though it was the middle of the night. General Stone, the first agent said. He opened the door. "Welcome back, Mom." "Thank you," I said. I slid into the back seat. The door closed with a solid, vault-like thud. The car began to move immediately, joining a small motorcade of police motorcycles that had their lights flashing but their sirens off. We sped toward the highway, the lights of Washington, D.C. glowing on the horizon like a distant fire. I looked out the window at the passing blur of trees and guardrails. My mind drifted, unbidden, back to the house on the cul-de-sac. It was 2 o'clock in the morning in Missouri. The lights in the dining room would be off by now. My father would be asleep, or perhaps passing out in his chair, the empty bourbon bottle standing sentinel on the table. My mother would be in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the symmetry of her life had collapsed so quickly. Leo would be awake. He would be online, frantically refreshing his social media feeds, watching the narrative slip through his fingers like sand. I wondered if they had tried to use the credit card yet. I wondered if the automated email from the bank had arrived in my father's inbox, notifying him that the standing transfer order had been canceled. I wondered if they felt it yet. The sudden, terrifying absence of the safety net they had never bothered to acknowledge. I felt a phantom vibration in my hand. A ghost of the phone I had incinerated. I clenched my fist, forcing the sensation away. The cord was cut. The bridge was burned. There was no going back across the river. The motorcade swept onto the 395 bridge. The Pentagon loomed ahead, a massive, brutalist fortress of concrete and stone. It was ugly. It was imposing. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We pulled into the underground entrance. The car stopped. The agent opened the door. I stepped out onto the gray concrete of the loading dock. A Navy admiral was waiting for me near the elevator bank. He was in his 60s. His white uniform stark against the industrial gloom. It was Admiral Vance, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was a man who ate grandfathers like Arthur Stone for breakfast. Lucia, he said. He did not salute. We were past that. He extended a hand. Admiral, I said, taking his grip. It was firm, dry, and professional. Good to have you back, he said. We have a situation developing in the South China Sea. The secretary wants you in the tank immediately. I nodded. Lead the way. We walked to the elevators. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a steel box. I heard you had a family dinner tonight, Vance said, his eyes watching the floor numbers climb. I did, I said. How was it? He asked. It was clarifying, I said. He looked at me, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. He knew. In this building, everybody knew everything. The doors opened on the 3rd floor. We walked down the E-ring corridor. The floor was polished to a mirror shine. The walls were lined with portraits of past generals and secretaries. They looked down at me, stern and silent. I met their gaze. I belonged here. I was one of them now. We reached the heavy wooden doors of the conference room known as the tank. A Marine sentry snapped to attention. General Stone, he barked. I walked through the doors. The room was cold. It was kept at a constant 68 degrees to protect the server banks and keep the occupants awake. A massive oak table dominated the center of the room. It was not like the mahogany table in Missouri. This table was scarred, functional, and covered in secure tablets and maps. Around the table sat 12 of the most powerful people in the Western Hemisphere. The Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, the National Security Advisor. They were all in shirt sleeves, ties loosened, coffee cups steaming in front of them. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. 12 heads turned. For a second, I felt a flicker of the old instinct. The instinct to shrink. The instinct to apologize for interrupting. The instinct to go find a chair in the corner and make myself invisible. Then I remembered the dry chicken. I remembered the word burden. I remembered the feeling of the rain on the porch. I walked to the empty chair at the center of the table, directly opposite the Secretary of Defense. I pulled it out. I sat down. I placed the folder on the table. I opened it. Good morning, I said. My voice was not loud, but it filled the acoustic space of the room completely. Let us begin. The Secretary of Defense looked at me. He looked tired, his eyes rimmed with red. General Stone, he said. We are tracking a communications blackout from the asset group in Sector 4. We believe the regime has compromised the network. We are looking at a total loss of intelligence in the region within 6 hours. I looked at the map displayed on the main screen. I saw the red zones expanding. I saw the blue lines of our supply chains fragmenting. It was a mess. It was a disaster. It was a logistics problem. They are not compromising the network, I said. I tapped the map. They are overloading it. Look at the data spikes in the commercial sector. They are using civilian traffic to mask a denial of service attack. The CIA director frowned. We considered that, he said. But the bandwidth requirements would be astronomical. They don't have the capital. They do if they are borrowing it. I said. I looked at the director. Check the transaction logs for the offshore accounts we flagged last month. The ones moving through the shell companies in Singapore. The director tapped his tablet. He scrolled. He stopped. His eyes widened. Holy hell, he whispered. She is right. They are routing the traffic through a dummy corporation. He looked up at me. How did you know? I didn't smile. Because that is how I would do it, I said. If I wanted to hide a weakness. The room shifted. The tension did not dissipate, but it changed flavor. It went from the panic of the unknown to the focused energy of a solution. They were listening to me. Not because I was loud. Not because I was a man. But because I was right. I spent the next 4 hours orchestrating a counter-offensive. I moved fleets. I rerouted satellites. I authorized cyber strikes that would darken a city on the other side of the world. I worked with a precision and a fluidity that felt like breathing. At 700 hours, the sun began to rise over the Potomac. The red zones on the map stopped expanding. The blue line stabilized. The Secretary of Defense sat back in his chair. He rubbed his face with both hands. Good work, people, he said. We held the line. He looked at me. General Stone, he said. You saved us a lot of trouble this morning. I just did the math, Mr. Secretary, I said. He stood up. The meeting was adjourned. As the room cleared out, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. I gathered my papers. I stood up. Admiral Vance was waiting for me by the door. You need to get some rest, Lucia, he said. You have been awake for 24 hours. I am fine, I said. He put a hand on my shoulder. Go home, General. That is an order. The word landed strangely. I walked out of the tank and down the corridor. I took the elevator to the lobby. I walked out into the morning light. My driver was waiting. Where to, ma'am? He asked. I paused. I realized with a sudden jolt that I did not have a home. My apartment in D.C. was a sublet I barely used. My stuff was still in boxes. And my real home was a 3-bedroom house in Missouri that I had just foreclosed on emotionally. I got into the car. Take me to the river, I said. The driver nodded. We drove to the banks of the Potomac. I got out. I walked to the railing and looked at the water. It was brown and churning, swollen with the same rain that had fallen on my parents' porch. I took a deep breath. The morning air was cool. I reached into my pocket, out of habit, looking for my phone. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to call my mom and tell her I was safe. I wanted to tell her I had had a good day at work. I wanted to hear her voice, even if it was just to ask me about the weather. But the pocket was empty. The realization hit me then, sharp and final. I had won. I had proven them wrong. I had ascended to the highest levels of my profession. I commanded armies. I saved nations. But I was standing by a river at 7 in the morning, and I had no one to call. The tears came then. They were not the hot, angry tears of the night before. They were cold, quiet tears. They were the price of admission. I let them fall. I did not wipe them away. I stood there for 10 minutes, mourning the family I never really had, the family I had finally stopped trying to invent. Then, I stopped. I took a handkerchief from my pocket. I dried my eyes. I straightened my uniform jacket. I checked the stars on my shoulders to make sure they were aligned, turned back to the car. The driver was waiting, holding the door open. "Ready, General?" he asked. I looked at the city skyline, rising white and clean against the blue sky. I looked at the future. "Yes," I said. "I am ready." I got in the car. I did not look back. It had been 6 months since I stood by the Potomac River and wept for a family that did not exist. Now, it was January. The heat that had suffocated the dining room back in July was a distant memory, replaced by a biting, clean cold that settled over the Ozark Mountains. I stood on the deck of the house I was building. It was not a mansion. It was a simple structure, cedar and stone, sitting on 40 acres of land, exactly 150 miles away from the Cull, D-Sac, where I grew up. It was far enough to be a journey, but close enough to remind me that I did not have to leave my home state just to leave my history. I held a mug of coffee in my gloved hands, watching the sun rise over the ridge. The air smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. It was quiet here. But it was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of peace. My phone, a new device with a new number, sat on the railing. It buzzed. I picked it up. It was a text from Admiral Vance. "Briefing at 0800. Secure line. Hope the cabin is coming along." I smiled. I typed back. "Roof is on. Windows are in. I will be ready." I put the phone down. The connection to my old life, the life of the dining table, had not snapped violently. It had withered, like a vine cut off from its water source. In the weeks after I left, there had been a flurry of attempted contact. Leo had sent emails to my official public address, oscillating between rage and begging. He claimed the bank was threatening foreclosure. He claimed it was my fault. He claimed I was destroying the family. I deleted them without reading past the first line. My father never called. Not once. His pride was a fortress that had become his prison. To reach out to me would be to admit he needed me. And Arthur Stone would rather freeze in the dark than admit he could not pay for the light. My mother was the only one who broke through, in her own quiet, tragic way. A Christmas card had arrived at my office in the Pentagon 3 weeks ago. It had no return address. Inside there was no letter. No apology. Just a generic printed greeting and her signature, shaky and small, at the bottom. She had enclosed a recipe card for apple pie. I had looked at that card for a long time. It was an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire. It was her way of saying she loved me. But also her way of saying she still only knew how to love me through the domestic roles she understood. She wanted me to bake. She wanted me to be sweet. She did not know how to love the general, so she sent a recipe to the daughter who no longer existed. I filed the card in a drawer and went back to work. I took a sip of coffee, the steam warming my face. I had spent my entire life trying to buy my way into their hearts. I thought that if I was useful enough, successful enough, generous enough, the transaction would finally balance out. I thought love was a ledger. I was wrong. Love is not a debt to be paid. It is a choice to be made. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew my attention to the long driveway. A truck was pulling up. It was a delivery of lumber for the barn I planned to build in the spring. The driver hopped out. He was a local man, older, with weathered hands. He waved at me. "Morning, General," he called out. "Morning, Tom," I shouted back. He did not call me General because he was impressed by the stars. He called me General because I paid him on time. I looked him in the eye, and I treated him with respect. He respected me because I had earned it, not because I demanded it. I walked down the stairs to meet him. My boots crunched in the snow. I felt strong. My shoulders, which had carried the invisible weight of my father's expectations for 3 decades, felt light. I helped Tom unload the wood. We worked in rhythm, breath pluming in the cold air. When we were done, I signed the invoice. "You have a good day, ma'am," Tom said, tipping his cap. "You too, Tom." As he drove away, I looked back at my house. It was small. It was unfinished, but it was mine. I had paid for every beam, every nail, every pane of glass. There were no ghosts in these walls. There were no secrets in the floorboards. I thought about the toast my father had given that night. Some people are meant to shine, and others are meant to carry weight. He meant it as an insult. He meant to say I was a beast of burden, a creature designed to haul his baggage so he could walk unencumbered. But he was wrong about the nature of weight. Weight makes you strong. Carrying responsibility. Carrying the safety of a nation. Carrying the truth when everyone else is lying. That does not crush you. It forges you. It turns you into something steel. Something necessary, something real. I was not a burden. I was the foundation. And now that I had removed myself, their house could stand or fall on its own merits. I was no longer holding up the sky for people who would not look up to see it. I walked back up the stairs to my deck. I turned and looked out over the valley. The sun was fully up now, turning the snow to a blinding field of diamonds. I was Lucia Stone. I was a brigadier general. I was a daughter who had walked away. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I finished my coffee, set the mug on the railing, and went inside to take the call. The world was waiting, and I had work to do.